Hello Infiniteers, and welcome to a special documentary video about the making of my Zootopia toy box. Every once in a while, someone will ask me about my process for designing and implementing a toy box, and the thought and effort that I put into it, so I want to take this opportunity to give you a little peek behind the curtain and show you how I go about designing a toy box. And by making a special video to talk about this, I won't have to spend time discussing it during the playthrough video. My toy box designs always begin with an idea. As you know, I try to do something unique and original in each and every toy box, and one of the ideas that I've been toying with is how to create a mystery. I wanted to create a toy box where the player has to solve a mystery. The player would arrive at the scene of some crime, and using some kind of deductive process, they would have to search for evidence and use that evidence to identify the culprit. As I considered what that might look like in a toy box game, I thought about the kinds of things that detectives do in a mystery. One thing they do is look for clues. They dust for fingerprints, they look for objects that are out of place, they look for anything that doesn't belong. In the toy box, we have collectibles that we could use for that purpose, but the trick was how to assign some meaning to those collectibles. You would have to be able to look at a collectible and associate it with some specific person or place. So I looked in the editor at the different building pieces and townspeople that were available, and I discovered that many of the collectibles had a corresponding building piece that I could use to indicate a location for the player to visit. Another thing that detectives do is interview eyewitnesses. They talk to people at the scene of the crime and at various locations where they visit to find out what they saw or what they know. Now, this would be difficult to implement without a functioning text creator. Our text options are really limited, but one of the options that we have are the pre-canned phrases in the text displayer. So I looked through those to see what I had to work with. And one of the categories in the text displayer, called nouns, contains a bunch of weird random phrases like disco ball or telephone pole. And again, as I looked through the editor at the different building pieces that are available, I realized that in some cases we had building pieces that we could use that would correspond to these phrases. And in other cases, like the disco ball, we could actually make a building piece ourselves. And those discoveries guided the design of the mystery-solving mechanic for my toy box. I added a bunch of unique landmarks to various places in the toy box, all of which correspond to a collectible or a phrase. And when the player shows up at a location during a case, they look for a collectible or a townsperson to interview, and then follow that clue to a new location where they repeat the process, and they continue following the trail from location to location until they arrive at their final destination, where they find the culprit responsible. And to keep it from becoming too predictable, I set up the logic so that the game randomly picks from a set of collectibles and townspeople, which means that every time you play the game, the clues are different and will lead you to a different place. Now that I had the mystery design figured out, the next step was to decide on the theme for the toy box. I could have used a Marvel theme, like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. or Spider-Man, or I could have used a generic city theme, perhaps with Agent P as a private eye, but I decided to use Zootopia. Investigating cases and solving mysteries seemed like a perfect fit for a pair of cops like Nick and Judy. Also, I had been watching many of the original Disney Infinity trailers last year in preparation for the game's 10th anniversary, and one of the things that I noticed in those trailers was how often the sample toy boxes shown used a huge variety of building pieces that didn't really fit together thematically. It seemed like they had just thrown random stuff into their toy boxes, and yet the toy boxes looked fun and visually interesting. And I thought about how much fun it might be to build something freeform like that. Now what's interesting about Zootopia is that you have all of these different biodomes that make up the city. Each district has its own unique look, with its own climate and animal population. You have the shared downtown area, but you also have Sahara Square, which is where the desert animals live, Tundra Town, which is where the Arctic animals live, and the Rainforest District, which is where the jungle animals live. Each of these districts is huge, and each one could fill a toy box all by itself. But for my game's logic to work, I needed to scale down the city so that the entire city fit in one toy box, and that meant that I would not be able to recreate all of the movie locations in as much detail as I would normally like. But that was actually fine because we don't have a lot of Zootopia-specific building pieces that we could use anyway. So my goal was to try to capture the look and feel of the city without necessarily duplicating it in detail. This was one of my initial builds for Zootopia, and as you can see, it contains all 4 districts. And no matter where you are in the city, you can usually see the other 3 districts in the background. I have the downtown area with police headquarters, Sahara Square, Tundra Town, and the Rainforest District. Part of my downtown area was inspired by this Disney Infinity promotional screenshot, and I actually recreated this location in my toy box, as you can see. But when I went to implement the logic for my mystery game, the logic quickly filled up the remaining toy box memory. I tried reducing the scale of the city even further, and eliminated a bunch of the more memory-intensive buildings, and that wasn't enough. Since the treehouse pieces took up a huge part of the memory, I tried replacing those with the Ewok trees, and that still wasn't enough. And in the end, as much as it pained me to do it, I had to remove Tundra Town and the Rainforest District in order to have enough memory for the logic. To fill up that physical space instead, I borrowed some of the building designs from a toy box that the Disney Infinity developers had created for Zootopia. The end result looks pretty good, and my version of Zootopia contains 2 of the city's 4 districts, but it still wasn't quite what I originally wanted. One of the things I plan to do in this series is to show you how to build both versions of the city. I'll start by showing you how to build my final version, and then after I've finished the build and the logic, I'll show you how to implement the ideal version of my city. And that way, those of you who are on systems with more memory can have the full toy box design as I originally envisioned it. And those of you who are on systems with less memory, who just want the build and don't plan to implement the logic, can also have the full city with all 4 districts. But with only 2 of the 4 districts represented in my toy box, I had enough memory on my Wii U to implement a wide variety of cases for Nick and Judy to solve and things for them to do. You'll be chasing after bad guys on foot and in your police cruiser, rescuing townspeople from burning buildings, and battling all sorts of enemies who are intent on causing trouble in Zootopia. It is a fun toy box to play in. I have even implemented a day-night cycle, for those of you who've asked me how to do that. It's a nice little feature that helps bring the city to life even more. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this brief look behind the scenes at the making of my Zootopia toy box and what you can expect to see in this series. Thank you for watching. Be sure to subscribe to my channel before you go so you don't miss the start of this series on Monday, and leave a comment to let me know what you think of the design for my Zootopia toy box now that you've seen a little more of it. That's all for me today. Have a great weekend.